Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. The Canadian Church Leaders Network is all about seeding a hopeful future for the church in Canada by coming alongside pastors to serve, connect, and resource them as they go out and do the same for their communities. That's the vision. So if you're looking to be further resourced, connect with more church leaders across the country, or hear incredible stories of God's faithfulness in the church in Canada, follow us on Instagram by searching CCLN, visit ccln.ca, or subscribe to our channel below. Thanks again for watching this video. Have a good one.
Well, Chrishan, it's a real joy to be with you today. Thanks for making time to be on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, mate. Honestly, it's a joy for me.
Give us a little bit of context to your world. You're in New York City, you're pastoring, you got kids in middle school, high school. Tell us a bit about your universe.
Oh, yeah. We are living in New York. We've been here a couple of years now, and it is a city like no other I have ever lived in. We came from Australia, and it's funny because I think reflecting on it now, having been here for a few years, the assumption was it's going to be pretty much the same culture except in a different city because it's English speaking, it's Western, we watch all the same movies, we listen to the same music. But it is just so different living here, and it's been a beautiful kind of opportunity to explore a new place, a new way of living. It's a city full of possibility, and at the same time as it is so densely populated, it's also extremely lonely. So it's a city full of contradictions in many ways, but it's been a joy to be here. And our kids are getting used to apartment living, and they're grieving their backyard, and they're getting to make friends and doing all the things, and it's been great.
That's the primary thing my son Hudson reminds me. We used to live in the suburbs, and we moved to the city to start a church, and he goes, "Dad, we used to have a backyard." And he's like, it's like so sincere, and it breaks my heart because it's like, I'm like, he's like, "Why are we here?" I'm like, I think God brought us here, and there's nice parks, but you got to be careful in the parks. You can't just run anywhere. Yeah. So I really feel that deeply. Tell me about that journey of like moving from Perth with your family to New York. Like that, obviously, it's a massive decision. I'd love to hear what drove the decision, but then that discernment journey as a family, and some of that transition.
That was, it was a wild time. It was during the pandemic, and we loved where we lived in Perth. We were involved with our church, and doing more with our church in Asia. And we really had a passion there. I think we'd even taken time to kind of write down what we saw the next 10 years looking like, my wife and I, and we saw ourselves doing more in that part of the world. And we'd been having those kinds of conversations, with our senior pastor, and it was just, that's it. Everything was headed that way. And then during the pandemic, a bunch of things had gone on for church here in New York. And our senior pastor at the time, Pastor Brian, called us up and just said, "Hey, would you consider going to New York City and being a part of the team there?" And I think something within both of us, we'd both been out here for a retreat with a bunch of our leaders a couple of years prior. And so we knew a bunch of the people that were involved. Our hearts went out to them, and we just, I think something in both of us rose up and said, we just got to be there. And we'd always told Brian, "Look, you need us anywhere you tell us, and we'll go." And he'd always said, "Well, it's kind of your life and it's your destiny, so you need to seek God on that." But our leaning was always, if we're needed somewhere, we'll go, we'll be there. And so it wasn't at all what we expected, but we felt like it was the right thing to do. There was a synergy in both of us feeling a similar way about it. And so, took a step of faith, and we are here.
What was the journey like for the kids? I know that they were a lot younger at the time, but what was that journey helping as a father and mother, helping them understand what it meant for you to follow God's invitation?
Yeah. We'd made that move from Sydney to Perth, and again, they were younger still when we'd done that. And at each stage, I think my hope is that their feeling is that they're part of this with us. Our girls are all volunteering in the church with us, and doing different things in different areas of church life. And I think we kind of see it as like we're all in this together. But when we let them know we were moving to New York, I can remember that night they just cried. They just cried for a few hours and then cried themselves to sleep. And the next morning we were meant to be recording on Zoom a little announcement for church that this is what was happening. And so I called the guy who was organizing all of the filming, and I just said, hey, we might need to push this filming, because we just had a chance to tell them. It was really upsetting. I mean, it was upsetting for me. And if you ask them how they're feeling about it, I just don't know what's gonna come out of their mouth. And he was like, no, look, everything's lined up. We need to do it tomorrow. So we did it the next day. And by some miracle, I think when they were asked the question, how are you feeling about moving to New York? One of them just piped up and said, I'm excited. And I was like, bless you. I don't know that that's where you're at, but that's just what came out of your mouth. So it worked.
Give me the plot points. Like, I know there's turmoil in the church from past leadership. It's also pandemic time in a very intense city where it was, in a lot of ways, at least in North America, epicenter of many of the outbreaks. And where in the pandemic is it, and what are you salvaging? Like, what are the building blocks that you land to begin to pull together to even establish footing in those first months?
Yeah, I don't think we could have quite known the impact of all of the cultural dynamics that were at play at the time. Certainly not from where we were and where we were living. But landing in New York, it was the tail end of the pandemic. There was still a lot of restrictions around. There was still some schools that weren't meeting yet. And we landed in a context where our church had been here for over 10 years, but we didn't have a church building for gathering on Sundays. We'd used rented facilities for that kind of thing. And so when we got here, we weren't able to gather. So we're still just doing church online. Then as you're able to gather, we still weren't able to gather because we didn't have a place to gather. And all the places that we kind of used in the past were, many of them weren't wanting to take weekly Sunday bookings because they had all these kinds of acts coming through, and everything from music to whatever else that is, everyone's just making up for lost time during the pandemic. So no one wants the church taking up valuable kind of booking space on a Sunday at the time. And so it was such a struggle to get back to a place of being able to just meet every week. And we have a small office chapel. And so we eventually started meeting in that space. We could maybe see just over 100 in there. And so we just started running one service, then two, and then three. And it was just, how do you pull together everyone and help people walk through grief and trauma and all of those kinds of things, and not just try and sweep it under the rug or ignore it or minimize it, but engage with it. And then how do you fortify yourself so that as you're engaging with all of those things that are going on for others, you're not feeling overwhelmed yourself. And we certainly did feel very overwhelmed at times. And so all of those dynamics were at play. I think because you're looking at grief, because some of this was really traumatic for people, it's a different journey for everyone. So then it's not something that you can prescribe, hey, you do this, then do this, and then we're all going to be good. It's like you're walking something through with people that's going to look different in every kind of instance and iteration of it. So that was huge. So the first part of it was really kind of trying to sit and listen to where people are at and what people's experience had been. And in our church, there was an acute kind of grief around the challenge of what the pandemic had meant in the city, the extent of racial and political division at a time when that could have pulled everyone together, but didn't. It splintered. And so in the midst of all of this upheaval, you've got the one safe place left for people where they still feel confident, comfortable, engaging God together in community, even though it's online. But the one kind of affinity that they had, where there was trust and there was something good happening, was church. And so by the time that was affected by all kinds of different things, you just had such a deep kind of grief in people at the loss of it, because they were grieving the loss of church. They were grieving the loss of pastors that you don't even know how to grieve, because it's not like someone's passed away, but they're no longer in that role in your life. And so you're grieving those things, but you're also grieving the loss of this space that had come to mean so much, already meant so much, had come to mean even more during uncertain times. And so I think that's what we kind of walked into, and needed to journey with people. We heard a lot of stories, which was a real privilege. People sharing a lot, and people that were all at different, kind of places at processing. And from there, we're able to start to put together some ways for us to engage in the work of transformation, and that's what we, I guess, really discovered. There's an author named Todd Bolsinger, and he wrote a book called Canoeing the Mountains. He's got some new work coming out to do with leadership and kind of working through some things like we worked through, and so he had some ways of articulating it, which, looking back, I was like, oh, I wish that was available. I wish this was available at the time. But he talked about the leaders and a leadership core need to go through the work of transformation in order for an environment to be transformed, in order for a community to be transformed. And so that really was what we had embarked on. And I used to tell people that, I think it's going to take, a good 3 to 5 years before we're at a place where there's something really good, really healthy. There's kind of all of the things that we're engaging with are starting to become part of the culture and part of the fabric of our community. And I would say that, but in my mind, I was thinking, yeah, but we're going to knock it out in, probably 2, I'm thinking this is going to be quicker than what I'm saying. And now, having been here for close to 3 years, I'm like, no, it's really going to take kind of the upper end of that to get all of this into a place where we've been transformed. That's the time-consuming part, is as leaders and as pastors, we're being transformed, and without our transformation, there's we can't just import it into our church unless it flows through us. So, yeah.
Can you tell me a bit more about that? Like this idea of, if we want to see a transformation in our community or in the life of the church, you kind of describe these kind of concentric circles, and it begins with that inner transformation. Tell me a bit more about that journey, and even were you able to even articulate early on what that transformation needed to be? Or like there's this sense, hey, like we can't stay where we are. This isn't healthy. We want to go. But to begin to articulate what is this transformation journey, and then how does that journey play out in those small concentric circles before the whole?
Yeah. It's funny. I think in the initial stage, you can more quickly articulate, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right. You can analyze and go, hey, these things are off. But then being able to sit back and go, oh, this is the work that needs to be done, and this is where we need to go. That was far more time consuming, and I think involved opening ourselves up to a whole lot of different ways of thinking, a whole lot of different ways of forming, and ways that maybe we hadn't engaged with before, because what we were doing seemed to be so great, seemed to be going so well, seemed to be so successful. And so part of that isn't just a desire to, oh, we're so good. Part of that is just, you're so busy doing the things. That something in the back of your mind is like, yeah, we've got to engage with some of this stuff, but we'll get round to it, because there's so much to do right in front of us. There's next Sunday coming. And so partly the pandemic, partly everything that went on in our church, we did have a bit of space to go, hey, and we were forced to go, how do we need to, what needs to be reinvented here? I think early on we started to ask those questions. Like we started to think about, what's our charism? So what's unique about our church that what do we bring to the broader body of Christ in the city? Because there are phenomenal churches in the city. So what is it that we bring that's unique, and how do we be faithful to that? How do we steward that? And so what are we keeping? What are we reinvigorating? So what was there maybe in our origin story that we need to reinvigorate in the life of our church? And then what do we need to bring in that we don't really see there at the moment? Like, what do we need from the outside? What's there in the broader body of Christ that we need to be strengthened in? And so we started, mulling around those ideas, listening to a lot of people tell stories, was a lot of that journey of kind of processing some of that. And then engaging in some work. We had some of the team had already been doing the work, researching a bunch of different courses that might have worked well for our church and for us to go through as a team. And so they'd really narrowed down to the emotionally healthy discipleship coursework, which is 2 courses. There's the emotionally healthy relationships and emotionally healthy discipleship. And so we connected with a guy named Drew Hyun in the city. He's a phenomenal pastor, and I mean, just the most generous. I couldn't speak more highly of him. Like, this guy welcomed us to the city. It leveraged all of his relationships to help us. And then I don't think I knew at the time, because he did that so quickly. I don't think I realized at the time how rare or how beautiful that was. But so we expressed an interest in emotionally healthy. He's really involved in that organizationally and been through a lot of that himself, has worked with Pete and Jerry Scazzero a lot. So he organized, Pete was, doing a Zoom, as he does for a number of leaders. And so, Drew organized for us to be sitting at Jerry's table, and she was kind of our table leader, taking us through the course, and that kicked off a whole lot of learning for us, and emotional learning that was very needed for me. And feels silly to talk about, because I was already into my 40s. But I was learning to do things that I probably should have learned a long time ago, like articulate my emotions and be able to put words to what I'm feeling. And I just never grown up in an environment like that, and it wasn't anything that I'd seen men model before in my life. And I'd seen men, and I'd seen people model, maybe joy and anger. And so turns out there's a whole lot more emotions than that. And so I had a workbook for the emotionally healthy relationships course, and in the back of it is an appendix. It's got all the feeling words. And to this day, if I open that workbook, it automatically opens to the appendix of feeling words, because it was my most used page in that book. So, a lot of that stuff started to really, help us in the work of transformation, help us in terms of practices that we needed to help and teach our church with. I've grown up in church and been in church for a long time. I'd never heard a message on grief. So how do you grieve? How do you process these things? We were coming out of a pandemic where even for funerals, many of those, we weren't able to gather in person or be connected with others. So what does grief look like outside of a funeral service? And what does it look like when you're grieving things that you don't have a funeral service for? So a lot of that was part of that journey, and that's what we kind of embarked on. Interestingly, reflecting on Todd and some of his work, he talks about how you really need 2 teams. You need like a transformation team, and you need a team that's creating a holding environment. And he said the holding environment team is normally the board or a team like that, but it's a team of people who are kind of helping people understand, hey, everything's going to be all right. Like, we're going to get there. We're doing the work. transformation's got to take place through leadership and it's going to flow into the church. They're creating a holding environment where people feel safe to continue going on that journey. And when I look back at kind of what we were walking through, it was the same team that was doing the transformation work that's trying to create the holding environment. And I wish we had some of those paradigms, because we could have been intentional about some of those things, and the existing structures that would have created a holding environment were overwhelmed, and so that some of that stuff didn't happen as well as it could have, and so I'd certainly do some of those things differently. But yeah, that kind of began a wonderful kind of journey of discovery of a whole range of different practices and tools in the broader church to do with formation, that I think was something we really needed to incorporate as a church.
One of the things you mentioned was this journey of identifying the unique charism or grace, and there's different words for it, but that's sort of hidden in the history, but also I don't know how God does it, like whether it's the collection of all these interconnected relationships, it's the story, it's the culture, but it's also the way his Spirit's at work in a community. And I'd love to hear, what was it that you identified was the unique grace on Hillsong New York, or maybe is Hillsong broader? I'd just love to hear more about that. It's really special to hear that.
Yeah. For me, reflecting on it and hearing people's stories of coming to church and coming to faith, there was an environment here where people could come into church on a Sunday from any kind of background, having been to church, having never been to church, coming from, having a lot of resources at their disposal to having very little, from a student to someone established in a career. I mean, just all kind of spectrums of life. People could come into an environment where there was something about the worship environment that people just felt at home in. And that worship created a space where people were able to come in and encounter God's presence and love in a way that felt tangible and real. And I think that's what we've kind of looked at and gone, that's something that we bring to the church. There's an environment where people are coming able to encounter and come to understand and feel God's love for them. And that's something we want to steward well.
And then you already kind of hinted at it, but you also said, okay, but I think there's some stuff from the broader body of Christ that we might be undercultivated in, or might be kind of missing in our robust discipleship journey. What was some of the main things that you're like, this is what I want to bring into the life of our community?
Yeah, totally. We had a very relational model of discipleship, which I think is part of that. I think guys like John Mark Comer are reflecting on that when he thinks about ideas of discipleship and apprenticeship, and the way that you follow or observe or watch someone. So we had that relational kind of underpinning, but we're very lean on what practices we engaged with. What do the practices look like, and how are we formed by those practices? I was impacted by the work of James K.A. Smith, and how he reflects on the way that practices form us. And there are things that we learn that aren't learned intellectually. They aren't learned because we read about them. They're learned in the doing of them. And that, I think, was leaner in our environment, and the culture that we'd come from. So engaging with something like the Emotionally Healthy course and learning about something like Sabbath, all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, there's a practice here. There's a rhythm here. We've never engaged in this or really talked about it, but this is something we need to engage with. Or a practice around how we engage with somebody else in our family, or how I engage with my wife when it comes to maybe incarnational listening or some different things like that. I think there are some ways that we could engage broader. And so it got us thinking about, all right, well, this is a really brilliant starting point, the Emotionally Healthy work, to introduce a bunch of practices that are going to help our church kind of come into a place of better health in how they relate to others, like how they relate to people, and how we relate to God as well.
And how did the church respond or receive that? And I know that you're such a thoughtful leader, and there would have been, care and thoughtfulness on the journey. It wasn't like an overnight switch, but was that met with a, like, oh, this is what we've been looking for? Or was there sometimes resistance, like, hey, this isn't the thing that I signed up for? What was your experience with the congregation?
Yeah. The vast majority of those experiences have just been really great. I think because we weren't, it took time to get to the point that we're doing this with a congregation. So firstly, there's a leadership core that are going through the course, and we're being changed, challenged, we're wrestling with it ourselves. And then we're working that out with a leadership community in the church. And then that's also a lot of conversation. And then you're rolling out courses like that into the broader body of the church. So by the time you're doing all of that, you're talking of like, I mean, it's like a year's worth or longer of kind of work before it's rolling out. So I think because you're wrestling with all of those things as you go, and you're wrestling with it yourself, you're then able to bring something that fits into the context of our community. I mean, I particularly love that the emotionally healthy work in particular has come out of a New York context.
Yeah.
He pastored in Queens for many years, and so it's well aware. It fits well with the context that we're in, and it worked brilliantly. I think there's different aspects of some of those practices that are more challenging for people than others, and some people respond to some bits differently to others. But it's so rich. We started with the emotionally healthy relationship course, and one of the reasons because it's so beautiful to be able to explore your own life and your own heart. One of the aspects of it is you do a genogram. So you look back through your family, a couple of generations, and you look at all of the aspects of unhealth in different areas, and some of these things, like you know when you sit and reflect, you understand it, but then when you put it down in black and white on paper and you draw kind of the diagrams, there are some themes that just start to become really obvious. It gives you some insight into yourself and your own kind of wiring, and so taking the time to do those kinds of things, we just found that our church loved doing that, loved the interpersonal conversations, loved different ways of having those conversations, and loved exploring the stuff about ourselves, and then having a space where you're able to talk about that, because when do you get to do that in life? And it was interesting because, you come into a city like New York, and just having been through the pandemic, anyone that ended up staying in the city through the pandemic, it's like everyone needed to see someone. Everyone needed some kind of space to be able to talk about and articulate all this stuff that's been going on. And so partly it was even just creating a space where some of that could happen in a healthy environment was great.
Earlier you mentioned Drew Hyun, and we've had him on the podcast before, and he's a pastor in New York City, but he does a lot of things. And when you describe the way he welcomed you, like, one of the things I think I'd love to see popularized is like pastors and cities being for each other, and Drew is just like a shining star of that. Like, I just would love to chat a little bit more about just your experience of building relationships with other pastors in the city, different expressions and maybe denominations, and what that's meant for you, and any reflections you might have from that.
Yeah. I have a deep love for the body of Christ, like, broadly. And there are a lot of incredible churches here. And I don't know if it's a New York thing or not, but I've found people really open across a range of different types of churches. And it's been really beautiful. Maybe because we're all in New York together, and so, like, there's a sense of feeling like we're in this together.
Yeah, you know what this is like to pastor here,
Yeah. So there's that. It's a particular kind of fraternity of experience. So I found it to be really beautiful, and people have been super warm and welcoming. At least to my face, they've been really, really supporting. But I think it's deeper than that. And there's been some wonderful pastors that have become, close friends of mine, and get the chance to hang out, outside of contexts where there might be conferences or that kind of thing, just because we enjoy one another's company. So it's been really, really beautiful.
One of the things I've been thinking about recently, and I'm sure you experienced this, especially after all that Hillsong New York had been through is how to lead and pastor those who have been wounded by leadership or hurt, but even those that haven't directly. We live in a moment in history where there's like so much suspicion of leadership and there's vicarious hurt. How have you navigated that reality as you try to lead a people in the midst of an age where there's a suspicion of leadership, especially religious leadership, the thought that, you know, perhaps they don't have our best intentions in mind or there's ulterior motive or agenda? Curious how you navigated that.
Yeah, I think for us, consistency's been part of that. So just being consistent in showing up, our posture towards people, being available on Sundays. My wife and I aren't sequestered away anywhere during a service. Like my wife Danny stands on the doors every Sunday, every service. As people are coming in, as people head out, I stand at the front of the stage, and anyone that wants to come and talk or get prayer or anything like that is able to. So there's a bit of an availability, there's a consistency of that. We in planting a church in Perth, we led a lot through hospitality, and that's always been a part of how, you know, fundamental part of what I believe has been a core value in our church. So what does welcome home mean? Not just as a sign, but as it relates to kind of your experience of the church service, but what does it mean in terms of what that team is like? And so, you know, having people in our home has been huge for us, and people able to see us in environments that are not just church environments. And hopefully what they're then observing is a consistency of who we are in our family environment and when we're hanging out at Central Park through to when we're at church. And I think some of that just takes time. And then we consciously were looking at, well, what do we need to communicate and preach about and help our church journey with that we maybe haven't explored before? And so looking at, all right, so how do we talk about grief? And how do we help people journey some of this well? And engaging in some of those things, I think that we're a little outside of maybe how we engaged in those conversations before and publicly anyway. So taking some of what would have taken place on a personal level pastorally and trying to look at, well, how do you take a community through this altogether?
As I was preparing for this conversation, I've been so looking forward to it. One of the team members forwarded me a link to a series of letters that you wrote for your church. And this morning I just was listening, because you did an audio version as well. I was able to listen to them. And it was just so precious to me hearing the heart of a pastor. And I know those were some time ago that you wrote them, but like, hopefully this isn't a bad comparison, but you know, the Apostle Paul writes to a church that he loves. And these letters have this like, obviously we experienced them in this transcendent way, but it was a particular people in a particular place, a particular time with real challenge, a real moment in history. And then like you get this window in, and you know, Paul's pretty intense sometimes, but he can be quite tender. He'll be like, you know, I really long for you. And I just sensed the pastoral care and heart and wisdom. And it was just such a joy to read them. And I imagined what letters I might write to my church, you know.
Yeah, the heart was to try and help people understand some of where we're going, some of what we're seeing, and help people understand that we are seeing that there are areas we need to grow in. And so they were 3 letters that were lengthy. Thank you for listening to them. But they focused around those 3 questions, like what do we need to keep? What's beautiful about our church that we need to keep? What needs to be reinvigorated? That was part of our origin story, and then what needs to be brought in to help strengthen who we are. And so wrote 3 different letters around those 3 different questions, and just reflected on them through my personal journey, and then through our encounter with our church here, and then thinking about what does that look like in the future? Like, what does that look like for these things to be in operation? And for me, I've grown up in our church, so I've been in our church for, I mean, it's probably 38 years, something like that. And so I've seen it from a couple of hundred people through to what it is now in kind of different parts of the globe, and so there's I'm drawing on all of that, I think, as I reflect on what our church has meant for me and what it was like when I first started going, and what it's like now, and what it can be again. So yeah, it was really, it seemed like a really good idea at the time. It was far more time consuming than I imagined, and I think in the post-pandemic reality, you're weighing every word, as I think many of us have, preparing a Sunday sermon, which we now know is going to be recorded and left on YouTube somewhere. And so you're there's a certain level of attention to detail in the words. And I think because they were letters and articulated as such, it felt weighty like that for me. But it was an endeavoring to build some of that trust with our church and help them get to know who we were, because we were moving into a new environment, and help them understand, well, this is what we're seeing for the future.
It was special to hear the story of how your family's faith came alive through a critical moment in your dad's life and the way God intervened. It's just really special. And so thanks for taking the time to do that. And I know it was for your church, but from a pastor from another city to kind of get a window in, it was a real pleasure to read.
Oh, thanks.
With the time we have left, I wanted to ask where you see God at work in New York City. Where do you see signs of the kingdom in your church? Where do you see him uniquely at work? And then in your own life, where are you seeing just signs of God's unique movement in our time?
Yeah. I think there's a beautiful hunger in the city for God. Coming from our context in Australia, and landing in New York, it feels like the city, I think of Jesus's words, the fields are white for harvest. That's what it feels like. And it feels like there is a post-pandemic hunger for God. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a historian, and he kind of commented that throughout history, whenever there's been a pandemic, that kind of a cultural event or something that's impacted society like that, there's always been a huge increase in people coming into church and reckoning with their mortality and thinking about the future. And it's interesting that in this last pandemic that we've had, that it was almost the opposite. Like it's been slow for people coming back into a church environment, and in many places we're rebuilding what church looks like and how people are thinking about it. And so I feel like that's maybe still there. I feel like maybe that's still ahead of the church. There's an opportunity, and I'm seeing it with younger people. And I think there's a real, I think of all the places where I see something significant happening in the kingdom, I think in the spirit of the younger people in the city, there is a real openness to the things of God, and to who he is and his presence. And so, we're leaning into that, and our church in particular has a lot of young people, and always has kind of been that way. But that's been really beautiful to see, and the energy in that, and the desire to want to do something great for God. And
you mentioned before we started recording that you've been on like a pilgrimage of sorts, going through a bit of a spiritual process over, I think if you said, you describe it to me, over the last year or so. Tell me about this journey you've been on.
Yeah, there's an Ignatian kind of practice where where if you're about to be a novitiate, you would go through a 1 month kind of intensive praying through what they call spiritual exercises, and there's a version of that takes place over the course of a year instead. And so it's meeting with a spiritual advisor every week and engaging in the work of going through these spiritual exercises. And I literally just finished that only a couple of weeks ago. And it's the result of a kind of couple of years of connecting with Father George in the city. And the first year you're kind of learning about some practices like examine, and you're starting to understand some of the basics of things. And then at the end of the year, if you feel you're ready, if they feel you're ready, you kind of can step into doing this kind of journey called the 19th Annotation, the spiritual exercises, and it has just been so beautiful. The way that the Ignatian tradition engages imaginatively in contemplation, but just some of their ethos from the origins, I think I resonated with. They had this mentality that was, we want to be out there taking the gospel to the world, doing anything we can to help souls, because not everyone's going to come into a monastery. And so they had this real thinking around, well, wherever there's opportunity, we want to be able to step into those opportunities. But they were also really grounded in some practices that help keep them tethered to what God had called them to, and their relationship with Him and their relationship with one another. And I was like, I resonate with that. Like, that's so much like who we are at our best. Like, our church is like, we want to take the gospel into places where people aren't connecting with it, do anything we can to help souls. And we just lack some of those practices that help keep us tethered. And so I was all wanting to explore it. And so I think I walked in thinking I'd experience it, I'd reimagine it, we'd do some version of this. And then as I kind of went through it, I'm like, this is just too beautiful. I don't know if there is a reimagining of this. I think this is what it is. So that's very fresh for me. I'm still reflecting on that a lot, but I'm so grateful for the journey. And again, like, it's the generosity of a church leader in our city who doesn't have to take time every week to meet with me, but did, just because he felt it was the right thing to do and was moved to. And I'm just so grateful. People like Father George and Drew Hyun and Pete Scazzero and just the broader kind of church in the city.
I know that on this journey, it feels like you're doing well. Like, maybe you're just, the way the sun's hitting you, you look like you got some real joy in the heart. But I'm sure there's been just days where it feels like this mountain's too high to climb, and there's too many fires to even begin to put one out. And I just always imagine that somewhere listening to this conversation, there's a pastor who's wondering if it's worth it. He's wondering if they should keep going. And, man or woman on their way to the office listening to this podcast going, I got no joy in the tank. And I just wonder if you have a word for a brother or sister that maybe is feeling the weight right now. It doesn't feel full of life in their work they're doing.
Honestly, I feel like I'd probably have a better answer in a couple of years to be able to say, yeah, it's worth it. Keep going for it. I think that's where we're headed. But it's definitely felt, we've definitely felt the weight of it. And I think my wife and I both, we felt like we're wired for challenge. We felt like God's gifted us to be in the midst of challenge and to make a difference. And I have felt completely overwhelmed by the extent. And I think I've flirted with burnout and what that looks like. I've raced to try and get healthy things done via unhealthy means. And paid the price for that and learned things the hard way. At one stage, because we were responsible for a few different locations here, we were running the emotionally healthy relationship course. We were running 4 of those courses at the same time so that there was speed of outworking it through different communities. I purposely didn't tell Pete that I was doing that because I knew he would say that's like the opposite of
You're
what this
you're
whole
missing
thing
the point,
about.
man.
Like, you're missing the point. But we felt the pressure to need to be helping church move forward in different ways, and for that to be visible and felt. And so, I think we've made a bunch of the mistakes. There's so much we do differently, and we've felt the weight of it, partly because of paths we've chosen, partly because of things that have happened externally to us. But we've really fought for joy. And I think the power for me of what transformation has meant that I haven't just been trying to do something that's going to be good for the church. It's had to be good in my life first. And so the fruit of those practices, the fruit of engaging in those courses, the fruit of learning and growing has been in my life as well as outside of me. The fruit of having other pastors in our world, of having mentors and people that have lent in to want to support and encourage us. We've received strength from all of that. And so, if I was encouraging some pastors who are in this kind of space, I'd encourage you to, look beyond maybe even just your own tradition and your own space, to be able to see kind of the beauty and the strength that's in the broader body of Christ. Don't do it alone, because we're all going to feel overwhelmed and I think succumb to that alone. But inviting other people, looking for the people of peace that God is bringing into your world. Someone made the comment to me recently. They were like, look, what took place in New York City? They said, like, the enemy had been working at that plan for a long period of time. The confluence of events, everything that took place, the timing of it. And I sat and thought about that. I'm like, that's something that resonates as true. Not in the sense of we're going to blame the devil for everything and not take responsibility for anything. I'm not saying that at all. But there is a recognition that, some of what we wrestle with isn't just flesh and blood. And as true as that statement was, I think it's also true that at the same time, none of this takes God by surprise. And God's had a plan the whole time as well. And I think that's what we see powerfully in the Gospels, what we see powerfully in what Jesus is walking through, that we celebrated Easter. The enemy had a plan and executed it to perfection. But God had something in mind that took what the enemy had meant for evil and just completely flipped it on its head. And there's every chance that what you're walking through and feeling overwhelmed by as a pastor or as a leader has both of those things at play. And there's every chance. Yes, there are going to be areas you're going to need to take personal responsibility, change, grow. Absolutely. There's also going to be areas where you're going to need to recognize the battle is against flesh and blood. The battle isn't against your husband or against your wife. And some of the tension even that you're feeling in that relationship isn't about the other person. It's about the other things that are going on. And so to be able to sometimes recognize it as some of that means now I'm not at odds with the people in my life or the leaders or whoever. We're in this together. And then some of it's going to be to recognize, man, but God's got a plan. And if God's got a plan, like, he uses people over and over again. And so if you're in a desperate place, like, if you stick your head up for a moment and just go, who are the people of peace? Like, who are the people that like us, that have been like kind and generous towards us and offered to help? Like, who are those people that God has brought into our world? And then how do I open the door of my heart to some of those people and see what God does in terms of bringing, a sense of strengthening and support? And that would be my encouragement.
Well, it's been such a joy for me to spend this time with you. I'm so grateful for your life, your ministry, your family, your thoughtfulness, and the gift of sharing your story with us today. We were just so thankful.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me on. It's a joy to spend the time.
Hey, before you go, we want to let you know about a few things we do here at CCLN that might serve you as you lead yourself and others. First, we have a podcast. The Canadian Church Leaders Podcast features brand new episodes every 2 weeks, featuring conversations with church leader voices from across Canada and the world. We also send out a newsletter to our network every month that contains helpful resources and content that our team curates for pastoral ministry in the Canadian context. If you or your church wants to partner with CCLN in our mission to lift up and serve pastors across Canada, we invite you to consider making a one-time or regular donation. You can do that or find out more at ccln.ca/partner. Thank you so much for watching this video. From myself and the CCLN team, we love you and we are cheering you on.